Your interpreter lied. The words cut through the conference room so suddenly that even the air seemed to stop moving. A silver pen froze inches above a signature line. 12 attorneys looked up at once. 3 foreign investors exchanged uneasy glances. And at the center of it all, Billionaire CEO Victoria Sinclair slowly turned toward the man who had spoken. The strange part was not what he said. It was who said it. Because the man challenging a billion-dollar negotiation was not a lawyer. He was not an executive. He was not even supposed to be part of the meeting. He was a waiter carrying a tray of coffee. What happened next would save a fortune, expose a carefully hidden deception, and change 2 lives forever. But to understand how a single father working double shifts found himself standing between a billionaire and disaster, we need to go back 48 hours. The Sinclair Tower overlooked downtown Chicago like a monument built from glass and ambition. 47 floors above the busy streets below, Victoria Sinclair stood beside her office window dressed in a tailored white suit that reflected the afternoon sunlight. At 35, she had built one of the fastest-growing technology companies in America. Financial magazines called her brilliant. Competitors called her dangerous. Employees called her demanding but fair. Yet none of those labels mattered today. A merger worth nearly $2 billion was approaching its final stage. If completed successfully, it would expand her company across Europe and secure her position among the most influential business leaders in the country. On the polished conference table sat stacks of documents waiting for final review. Beside them rested a tablet displaying schedules, legal notes, and translations from international partners. Victoria trusted her team, especially Marco Ruiz, the professional interpreter who had been working closely with the European investors for months. Marco spoke confidently, dressed sharply, and carried himself like a man who belonged in every room he entered. He answered questions before they were finished. He anticipated concerns before they were raised. Most importantly, he made complex negotiations feel simple. That was exactly why Victoria relied on him. Across the city, however, life looked very different. In a quiet apartment above a family-owned restaurant, Ethan Brooks sat at a small kitchen table helping his 12-year-old daughter finish her math homework. The apartment was modest. The paint showed its age. The refrigerator hummed louder than it should, but laughter still found its way into the room. Ethan checked her answers, smiled, and slid a glass of milk across the table. His daughter grinned. For a moment, the stress of bills, overtime shifts, and endless responsibilities disappeared. Then his phone buzzed with a reminder. Another evening shift. Another night carrying trays through crowded dining rooms. Another night trying to build a future one paycheck at a time. Ethan stood, grabbed his restaurant uniform, and headed for the door. He had no idea that within 48 hours he would walk into a room filled with billionaires, lawyers, and executives. He had no idea that one sentence would place him at the center of a crisis worth hundreds of millions of dollars. And he certainly had no idea that somewhere high above Chicago, a woman in white was unknowingly placing her future in the hands of a man she should never have trusted. Victoria Sinclair had built her reputation on one principle: trust numbers, not promises. Yet over the past 6 months, she had slowly made one exception. Marco Ruiz had become more than an interpreter. He had become a bridge between cultures, languages, and billion-dollar opportunities. Every report he delivered was polished. Every meeting seemed smoother because of him. Every foreign partner appeared satisfied. From the outside, he looked indispensable. That Thursday morning, sunlight spilled across the 47th floor of Sinclair Tower as senior executives gathered around the conference table. Tablets glowed. Coffee steamed. Financial projections filled the giant display screens mounted along the wall. Victoria listened carefully as department heads presented updates on the European merger. Revenue forecasts looked promising. Expansion targets exceeded expectations. Market analysts predicted record growth within 18 months. It should have been exciting. Instead, a faint feeling of unease lingered in the back of her mind. She could not explain it. Perhaps it was simply the weight of responsibility. Nearly 20,000 employees depended on the decisions made in rooms like this. One mistake could ripple across thousands of families. One bad contract could undo years of work. Marco sat beside the legal team reviewing translated documents. His voice carried confidence. His posture never wavered. When one executive raised concerns about a licensing clause, Marco immediately answered. When another questioned an international compliance issue, Marco provided clarification before attorneys could even finish consulting their notes. Several executives nodded with admiration. Victoria noticed it too. He always had an answer. He always seemed prepared. Across town, Ethan Brooks spent his morning in a completely different world. The breakfast rush had ended, leaving the restaurant temporarily quiet. Sunlight filtered through the front windows, while waiters reset tables for lunch service. Ethan wiped down a booth near the corner and glanced at a photograph tucked inside his wallet. His daughter, Lily, smiled back at him from a school field trip taken 2 years earlier. Whenever life became overwhelming, that smile reminded him why he kept going. His manager approached carrying a clipboard. "Big event tomorrow night," he said. "Private corporate dinner. High-profile clients. We need our best staff." Ethan nodded. Extra hours meant extra money. Extra money meant fewer worries. "I will be there," he replied. The manager smiled. "Good. The guests are coming from all over the world. Half the room probably speaks languages I cannot even recognize." Ethan returned a polite smile, but said nothing. Years ago, comments like that might have amused him. Once upon a time, foreign languages had been his entire career. Today they were simply another part of a life he rarely discussed. Later that afternoon, Victoria stepped into a private strategy session with European investors joining remotely from Frankfurt and Zurich. Multiple screens illuminated the room. Voices echoed through conference speakers. Marco translated smoothly, almost effortlessly. Yet something unusual happened. One of the German investors paused after hearing Marco's interpretation. The hesitation lasted only a second, barely noticeable. Then the conversation continued. Nobody reacted. Nobody except Victoria. She narrowed her eyes slightly. The moment passed too quickly to analyze, but it remained with her long after the meeting ended. Meanwhile, hundreds of feet below the city skyline, people hurried through crowded sidewalks unaware that two separate worlds were quietly moving toward each other. A billionaire preparing for the most important deal of her career. A single father preparing for another shift, carrying trays and refilling glasses. Neither knew that within 48 hours, a simple conversation would reveal a truth hidden behind polished words, expensive suits, and carefully translated lies. Ethan Brooks had become remarkably skilled at being overlooked. Customers remembered the restaurant's food. Executives remembered business deals. Tourists remembered the view of the Chicago River from the dining room windows. Very few remembered the quiet waiter who kept coffee cups full and conversations uninterrupted. Most days, Ethan preferred it that way. Visibility had once been part of his life. Recognition had once mattered. But that was before everything changed. The restaurant began filling as lunchtime approached. Conversations blended into a steady hum beneath soft jazz playing through hidden ceiling speakers. Ethan moved between tables with practiced efficiency. He greeted guests, delivered meals, and answered questions with calm professionalism. To everyone around him, he looked exactly like what he appeared to be, a hard-working single father earning a living. Nobody knew that beneath the simple uniform was a man who had spent years negotiating international contracts across 3 continents. Nobody knew he spoke 5 languages fluently. Nobody knew that he could identify regional dialects faster than many professional translators. Those chapters of his life belonged to another version of himself, a version that felt increasingly distant. During a brief break, Ethan sat near the employee entrance reviewing a school email on his phone. Lily's science fair project had been selected for a regional competition. His tired eyes softened immediately. He smiled as he read her teacher's message for the second time. Moments like these reminded him that sacrifice was not loss. It was purpose. 10 years earlier, Ethan's future had looked completely different. He had worked for an international consulting firm specializing in cross-border negotiations. Long flights, luxury hotels, high-stakes meetings. His language skills had opened doors most people never saw. Promotions came quickly. Opportunities seemed endless. Then life presented him with a choice that no career plan could solve. After losing his wife to a sudden illness, Ethan became the only parent Lily had left. She was 2 years old, frightened, confused, in need of stability more than ambition. So he walked away from the world he had spent years building. One contract became none. One promotion became a resignation letter. Colleagues called him talented. Some called him foolish. Ethan ignored both opinions. He chose his daughter, and if given the chance, he would make the same decision again. That evening, as sunset painted the Chicago skyline in shades of gold and amber, preparations began for the private corporate event scheduled for the following night. Managers reviewed seating charts. Staff polished silverware. Reservation coordinators confirmed security arrangements. Ethan listened quietly while instructions were given. The event would host executives, investors, attorneys, and international guests connected to one of the city's largest business deals of the year. Extra professionalism would be expected. Extra discretion would be required. After the meeting ended, Ethan gathered his belongings and headed home. The train ride lasted 30 minutes. He spent most of it reading Lily's latest essay assignment while answering her text messages. When he finally opened the apartment door, the smell of pasta greeted him. Lily looked up from the kitchen counter and smiled. For a few hours, billion-dollar companies, corporate negotiations, and distant ambitions disappeared entirely. Yet somewhere across the city, another preparation was underway. In a luxury office overlooking the lights of downtown Chicago, Marco Ruiz reviewed translated contract documents one final time. His expression remained composed. His movements remained confident. But when he reached a particular section of the agreement, a faint smile crossed his face. It appeared for only a moment before disappearing again. No one saw it. No one questioned it. And no one knew that within 24 hours, a room full of powerful people would discover that words can be worth far more than money. Friday evening arrived with the kind of polished elegance that only money could create. Crystal chandeliers reflected warm light across the private dining hall reserved for Sinclair Technologies. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the Chicago skyline, while carefully arranged tables waited for executives, investors, attorneys, and international guests. Every detail had been planned with precision. Every seat carried importance. Every conversation had the potential to influence millions of dollars. Ethan Brooks arrived 30 minutes early, adjusted his uniform, and joined the rest of the service staff. The restaurant manager reviewed final instructions one last time. Discretion, professionalism, efficiency. The words were familiar. Ethan nodded and focused on his work. For him, this was simply another shift. Across the room, Victoria Sinclair entered surrounded by senior advisors and legal counsel. Her white suit stood out against the darker tones worn by everyone else. Conversations paused briefly as she crossed the room. Confidence seemed to follow her naturally, yet beneath her calm exterior, the pressure of the upcoming agreement weighed heavily. Months of preparation were leading toward tomorrow's final signing. Tonight's dinner was meant to strengthen relationships before the deal was officially completed. Marco Ruiz walked beside several European representatives, translating effortlessly as introductions were exchanged. Laughter came easily. Business appeared smooth. Everything looked exactly as it should. As guests settled into their seats, Ethan moved quietly between tables serving drinks and appetizers. Years of restaurant work had trained him to become nearly invisible. People rarely noticed the person carrying the tray. They spoke freely in front of him. They assumed he was not listening. Most of the time, they were right. Then something caught his attention. Near one corner of the room, two German investors stepped away from the main group and began a private conversation. Ethan happened to be nearby collecting empty glasses. He did not intend to listen. But the moment the conversation began, several words immediately stood out. The investors spoke in German. Fast, professional, specific. Ethan understood every sentence. His hand froze briefly around a water pitcher. One investor asked a question about a revised ownership clause. The other responded with visible concern. They seemed confused about numbers discussed earlier that afternoon. Ethan continued walking, but his mind remained fixed on the exchange. The confusion felt unusual. Experienced investors did not misunderstand details involving hundreds of millions of dollars. A few minutes later, Marco joined the same group. Ethan happened to be refilling coffee nearby when the conversation resumed. The investors asked for clarification. Marco answered confidently in German. The explanation sounded smooth, polished, professional. Yet something felt wrong. Ethan frowned slightly. A phrase had been altered. A key financial term had been softened. The overall meaning remained similar, but not identical. It was subtle enough that most listeners would never notice. Ethan almost dismissed it as a harmless simplification. Almost. Throughout the evening, He heard it happen again. And then again. Small adjustments. Tiny shifts in wording. Nothing dramatic. Nothing obvious. Yet each change nudged the conversation in the same direction. The pattern unsettled him. By dessert, the room buzzed with optimism. Executives toasted future success. Investors discussed expansion plans. Victoria appeared pleased with the progress. Marco moved confidently from group to group, earning praise for his work. Yet Ethan could not shake the feeling growing in the back of his mind. He had spent years negotiating international agreements. He knew how much weight a single word could carry. Sometimes fortunes were not lost through obvious deception. Sometimes they disappeared through carefully chosen translations. As the evening came to a close, Ethan gathered empty plates and prepared for cleanup. Then he overheard one final sentence spoken quietly in German near the exit. The words were brief, barely audible, but they stopped him cold. One investor asked whether Victoria fully understood the revised terms. The other gave a nervous laugh and replied, "Apparently not." For the first time all evening, Ethan felt certain something was terribly wrong. The next morning arrived gray and cool over Chicago. Clouds drifted between the skyscrapers while commuters filled sidewalks below. Inside Sinclair Tower, preparations for the final signing moved forward with quiet urgency. Attorneys reviewed documents one last time. Financial analysts verified projections. Assistants hurried through hallways carrying binders and digital tablets. Everything appeared orderly. Everything appeared certain. Yet certainty can be dangerous when built on trust that has never been questioned. Ethan Brooks woke before sunrise as usual. He prepared breakfast, helped Lily get ready for school, and drove her through morning traffic. She talked excitedly about her upcoming science competition while he listened with a smile. For a few precious minutes, life felt simple. Then he returned to the memory of the previous night's conversation. The German investors. The altered wording. The uneasy laughter. The growing suspicion refused to leave him alone. By noon, he was back at the restaurant preparing for another private corporate event connected to Sinclair Technologies. The final signing would take place in one of the restaurant's executive conference suites overlooking the river. Managers instructed staff to maintain complete discretion. Ethan nodded quietly and continued arranging place settings. But his thoughts remained elsewhere. Shortly after 3 o'clock, guests began arriving. Victoria entered with her legal team. Her expression was calm, focused, determined. Months of work had led to this moment. Across the room, Marco Ruiz moved effortlessly among executives and foreign investors. He greeted everyone with confidence. He translated introductions. He answered questions before they fully formed. Watching him, Ethan understood why nobody doubted him. Marco looked exactly like a man who deserved trust. The signing session began behind closed doors. Service staff entered only when needed. Coffee, water, light refreshments. Ethan moved silently through the room while negotiations continued. German, English, and occasional French phrases blended together around the conference table. For nearly an hour, everything proceeded smoothly. Then Ethan heard it again. A key financial clause appeared on a presentation screen. One of the German investors spoke carefully, emphasizing a specific ownership percentage connected to future licensing rights. Marco translated immediately. Ethan nearly stopped walking. The number remained the same. The sentence structure remained similar. Yet the meaning shifted. Slightly, deliberately. A future ownership protection became a future ownership condition. To most listeners, the difference sounded insignificant. To experienced negotiators, it was enormous. Ethan felt his pulse quicken. He delivered a coffee cup to one attorney and forced himself to keep moving. Perhaps he had misunderstood. Perhaps context explained the discrepancy. Minutes later, another clause appeared. Then another. Each time, the same pattern emerged. Small alterations. Strategic adjustments. Tiny changes that consistently favored one side of the agreement. Ethan's concern deepened. He was no longer observing isolated mistakes. He was watching a pattern unfold. Around the table, executives nodded confidently. Lawyers reviewed translated summaries. Victoria studied projections displayed on a large screen. Nobody appeared alarmed. Nobody seemed aware that the meaning of entire sections was quietly shifting in real time. Ethan stood near a service station along the wall pretending to organize glasses. Inside, a difficult battle unfolded. This was not his business. He was a waiter. He had responsibilities. He needed this job. Speaking up could cost him everything. Remaining silent would be safer. Easier. Simpler. Then he looked toward Victoria. She was preparing to place her trust in information she believed was accurate. And for the first time, Ethan realized that by the end of this meeting, silence might become far more expensive than speaking. The conference room grew quieter as the final stage of the signing approached. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, late afternoon sunlight reflected off the Chicago River in long ribbons of gold. Inside, attorneys reviewed the last pages of the agreement while assistants organized signature folders. Victoria Sinclair sat at the head of the table, studying the final summary presented before her. Months of negotiations, hundreds of meetings, endless revisions. Everything had led to this moment. Marco Ruiz stood beside the projection screen, translating the final discussion between the European investors and Sinclair Technologies. His voice remained calm, professional, confident. The room trusted him completely. Ethan Brooks stood near the service station holding a coffee pot. He had not moved in nearly a minute. His mind raced. Every instinct told him something was wrong. Every translation he had heard pointed in the same direction. Yet speaking up felt impossible. He was not part of the meeting. He was not part of the company. He was a waiter. The safest choice was silence. Then one of the German investors spoke again. The sentence was clear, precise, impossible to misunderstand. It referred to future ownership protections that would remain permanently attached to Sinclair Technologies. Marco translated immediately. Ethan felt his stomach tighten. The meaning had changed once more. Not a mistake. Not an accident. A change. Deliberate and calculated. Around the table, executives nodded. Several attorneys wrote notes. Victoria reached for her pen. The movement lasted only a second, but to Ethan it felt much longer. He thought of Lily. He thought of the years he had spent helping companies avoid exactly this kind of situation. He thought of what would happen if nobody spoke. The room suddenly felt smaller. The silence heavier. Victoria lowered her eyes toward the signature page. Marco continued speaking. The investors waited. And then Ethan took a step forward. The sound of his shoe against the polished floor drew several glances. Another step followed. Conversations paused. Marco stopped mid-sentence and looked over with visible irritation. One attorney frowned. Another checked his watch. Ethan set the coffee pot down carefully. His voice was calm when he finally spoke. Ms. Sinclair. The room turned toward him. Victoria looked up from the contract. Her expression showed polite confusion. Yes. Ethan swallowed once. Not from fear, but from the weight of what he was about to do. Then he said the words that would change everything. Your interpreter is not translating accurately. Silence arrived instantly. Not the ordinary silence of a business meeting. A deeper silence. The kind that makes people stop breathing for a moment. Marco stared at him. Several executives exchanged bewildered looks. One attorney let out a short laugh of disbelief. Victoria remained perfectly still. Her pen hovered above the page. Excuse me, she asked quietly. Ethan met her gaze without hesitation. The translation you have been receiving is not matching what is actually being said. Marco's face hardened. That is an extraordinary accusation coming from a waiter. A few nervous smiles appeared around the table. Ethan did not react. He simply looked toward the German investors and repeated their previous statement word for word in flawless German. The room froze. The investors stared back at him. One slowly sat forward in his chair. Another removed his glasses. Marco's confidence flickered for the first time all day. Victoria lowered her pen completely. Something had shifted. The agreement was no longer the center of attention. The quiet waiter standing beside the coffee station was. For several seconds, nobody spoke. The silence stretched across the conference room like a tightening wire. Outside the windows, Chicago continued moving as usual. Inside, an entire billion-dollar negotiation had suddenly stopped. Marco Ruiz recovered first. A thin smile appeared on his face as he folded his hands. With respect, he said, looking toward Victoria, I believe we are allowing a misunderstanding to distract from important business. Several executives nodded cautiously. The explanation sounded reasonable. After all, Marco was the professional interpreter. Ethan was a waiter. Victoria remained silent. Her eyes moved from Marco to Ethan and back again. She was not a woman known for making quick judgments. She believed in evidence. Facts. Verification. Can you explain exactly what was translated incorrectly? She asked. Ethan nodded. Yes. Marco's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. Ethan looked toward the German investors. Then he repeated another section of their earlier discussion in fluent German. The pronunciation was precise. The rhythm natural. There was no hesitation in his voice. One investor immediately responded in German. Ethan answered. A second investor joined the conversation. Ethan replied again. The exchange lasted less than a minute, yet the atmosphere inside the room changed completely. The investors no longer looked confused. In fact, they appeared relieved. One of them finally turned toward Victoria and spoke directly in English. Your employee is correct. We believed several provisions had already been explained differently. A murmur moved around the table. Attorneys began reviewing documents again. Screens displayed translated summaries beside original contract language. For the first time, people started comparing them line by line. Marco adjusted his tie. Translation often requires interpretation of context, he said smoothly. Different wording does not necessarily mean different meaning. It was a clever defense. Calm, professional, reasonable. But Ethan had spent too many years around international contracts to be persuaded by polished explanations. Context matters, Ethan said quietly. That is exactly why the changes matter. He pointed toward a licensing clause displayed on one of the screens. The original language guarantees permanent participation in future revenue streams. The translated version makes that participation conditional. Those are not equivalent concepts. One attorney immediately leaned closer to his monitor. Another requested a copy of the original language. The room filled with the soft clicking of keyboards. Victoria watched everything unfold without interruption. Her pen remained untouched beside the contract. Then another discrepancy appeared. And another. And another. Each one seemed small on its own. A word replaced here. A condition softened there. A protection weakened somewhere else. Individually, they looked harmless. Together, they painted a troubling picture. The financial impact grew larger with every review. Tens of millions. Then hundreds of millions. Future ownership rights. Licensing protections. Long-term control provisions. The cumulative value became staggering. One executive removed his glasses and rubbed his forehead. Another attorney sat back in disbelief. Marco's confidence began to fade. Not dramatically, just enough for careful observers to notice. Victoria noticed. Ethan noticed. So did the investors. The room that had entered expecting a celebration now felt like a courtroom built entirely from spreadsheets and contracts. Nobody laughed anymore. Nobody checked their phones. Nobody looked toward the windows. Every eye remained fixed on the documents. And for the first time that afternoon, Victoria Sinclair realized she might have come within a single signature of losing far more than money. She might have lost control of the future she had spent years building. No signatures were placed on the contract that afternoon. Instead, teams of attorneys remained inside the conference room for hours, reviewing every translated clause against the original documents. The celebration that had been planned quietly disappeared. Coffee grew cold. Sunset faded beyond the windows. The atmosphere shifted from confidence to careful examination. Victoria Sinclair remained at the table long after many executives had left. She listened. She compared documents. She asked questions. And with every answer, one truth became increasingly difficult to ignore. The waiter had been right. Shortly after 8 o'clock, the meeting finally ended. Additional reviews would be required before any agreement moved forward. The investors returned to their hotels. Attorneys carried boxes of files toward waiting elevators. Marco Ruiz left the building under the watchful eyes of compliance officers and legal advisors. Nobody accused him of anything publicly. Nobody raised their voice. But nobody trusted him anymore either. Through it all, Ethan Brooks returned to work. He gathered empty cups, cleared conference tables, helped stack chairs. It was almost as if nothing extraordinary had happened. That was what surprised Victoria most. She found him 20 minutes later near the service hallway rolling a cart toward the kitchen. Mr. Brooks. Ethan stopped and turned. Ms. Sinclair. For a moment neither spoke. The noise of dishes and distant conversations echoed softly around them. Finally, Victoria asked the question that had been on her mind since the afternoon. How does a restaurant waiter speak German like a native and understand international contract language better than some of my consultants? Ethan smiled faintly. Not proudly. Not defensively. Just quietly. A long time ago, I worked in international negotiations. Victoria studied him carefully. A long time ago. Ethan nodded. Before my daughter needed me more than my career did. Something in his answer made her pause. Most people she met introduced themselves through achievements, titles, accomplishments, wealth. Ethan introduced himself through responsibility. The difference felt important. Later that evening, curiosity led Victoria to request a background review. She expected a few surprises. She did not expect what she found. Ethan Brooks had once advised multinational corporations on cross-border agreements worth hundreds of millions of dollars. He had studied languages overseas. He had built a reputation for identifying hidden risks in international contracts. Former colleagues described him using words rarely found in corporate evaluations. Honest, brilliant, trusted. One former executive wrote a simple sentence that stayed with Victoria. If Ethan told you a contract contained a problem, you listened. Yet 10 years earlier, he had resigned. Not because of failure, not because of scandal, because his young daughter had lost her mother and needed her father. Victoria sat alone in her office reading the report long after midnight. The city lights shimmered beyond the glass walls. She thought about the executives she knew, the investors she met, the powerful people who constantly chased larger opportunities. Then she thought about a man who had walked away from all of it for a little girl. Suddenly, the events of the afternoon looked different. Ethan had not spoken because he wanted recognition. He had not intervened because he wanted money. He had spoken because the truth mattered. The next morning, while most of Chicago hurried toward another workday, Ethan stood outside a school building helping Lily carry a science project inside. She laughed when one corner of the display nearly tipped over. Ethan steadied it and smiled. Neither noticed the black sedan parked across the street. Inside the car, Victoria Sinclair watched quietly through the window. For the first time in many years, the billionaire who had spent her life measuring value through numbers found herself wondering about something money could never calculate. 3 weeks later, the revised agreement was finally signed. This time, every clause had been reviewed by independent translators, international attorneys, and outside consultants. Every number matched. Every provision was verified. Every word carried exactly the meaning it was intended to carry. When the final signatures were completed, Sinclair Technologies secured its expansion plans without sacrificing the protections that had nearly disappeared. Industry analysts called it one of the most successful agreements of the year. Victoria Sinclair knew the truth was far simpler. One honest man had prevented a costly mistake. Yet while headlines celebrated the deal, Ethan Brooks returned to his ordinary routine. He worked his shifts. He paid his bills. He attended Lily's science competition and proudly watched her receive recognition for her project. Life continued much as it always had. That was what fascinated Victoria most. Most people who suddenly found themselves connected to billion-dollar decisions wanted something. A promotion, a reward, a favor. Ethan had asked for nothing. One rainy Thursday evening, Victoria walked into the restaurant without assistants, attorneys, or executives. The dinner rush had just begun. Soft music drifted through the dining room while conversations blended into a warm background hum. Ethan was carrying a tray of drinks when he noticed her sitting alone near the window. He paused briefly before approaching. "Good evening, Miss Sinclair." Victoria smiled. "Victoria is fine." Ethan returned the smile. "What can I get for you?" She glanced at the menu before looking back at him. "Actually, I came to ask a different question." Ethan waited. "I have reviewed your background," she said. "You could work almost anywhere. Why stay here?" Ethan looked toward the front entrance where rain tapped softly against the glass. For a moment, he seemed to consider the answer carefully. Then he reached into his wallet and removed a photograph. Lily stood beside a science fair display, wearing a proud smile. "Because this schedule lets me take her to school every morning," he said. "Because I can be home for dinner most nights. Because success means different things to different people." Victoria looked at the photograph, then at Ethan, then back at the photograph again. The answer carried no bitterness, no regret, only peace. A week later, she offered him a consulting position with complete flexibility and remote work options designed around his family life. Ethan accepted, not because he wanted status, but because it allowed him to provide more opportunities for Lily without sacrificing time with her. Months passed. Their friendship grew slowly and naturally, built on respect, built on honesty, built on conversations that rarely involved money at all. One autumn evening, Ethan and Lily attended a charity event hosted by Sinclair Technologies. As guests filled the ballroom, Victoria stood on stage thanking supporters and community partners. Then she unexpectedly paused. Her eyes found Ethan in the crowd. "The most valuable asset any company can have is trust," she said. "And sometimes the person who protects it is the one nobody notices." The room followed her gaze. Hundreds of people turned toward Ethan. Some began applauding. Then more joined. The sound spread throughout the ballroom until every seat was filled with appreciation. Ethan looked uncomfortable. Lily looked delighted. Victoria smiled. And for a brief moment, the room became completely still. Not because of power, not because of wealth, but because everyone present recognized something increasingly rare. Quiet dignity. The kind that does not demand attention. The kind that simply tells the truth when it matters most. And in that silence, nothing more needed to be said.